Hi, everyone. Welcome to the April 24th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to handicap some racing from Oaklawn Park and Gulfstream in Florida. I think I said when we did the TimeformUS Pacecast back on Tuesday that we weren't going to have that much top-level racing to discuss this weekend, but I'm not sure that's turned out to be totally true because some of these stakes races, especially at Oaklawn, have come up pretty tough. We've got some really nice horses, especially in the Carousel there, their 10th race on Saturday, but we'll start at Gulfstream Park this week. Talk about some allowance races as well. There's some interesting runners returning that recent stakes company last year. So, Craig, let's get right into the racing. We'll start at Gulfstream Park with race 8 on the card. It's an optional claiming 50,000 nominators or two other than going the two-turn mile and the 16th distance with that short stretch run. And I think this is one of the more competitive races we're going to talk about.
Yeah, we're actually, in my opinion, going to talk about a lot of really competitive races, but this one is right up there with them. It's a race, as you mentioned, at that mile and a 16th at Gulfstream where you have a short run into the first turn. The pace projector predicts the pace will be fast, but that's something that I kind of take with a grain of salt at this distance because speed does so well and saving ground is so important. And if you save ground as a closer, you just can't make it up late because the stretch is a bit shorter than usual. So, this is a case where, for me, I like I said, the pace projector, I kind of ignore it in these races unless it just looks like a total meltdown, and I don't see it here. That said, it's quite a race to handicap. The favorite, Legit, the morning line favorite, just returned from a nearly two-year layoff with a solid effort, if not, eye-catching or anything. He got a 107 chasing the very fast Chateau, who we've talked about before on our various podcasts and forecasts and whatnot, but this one's a real head scratcher for me. Normally, I would like a horse like War Giant, who comes in off a big figure, draws the inside, has plenty of speed, but his trainer's been pretty ice cold lately. He's a guy who's only been winning with severe drop downs, of which this is not one. So it's kind of hard to trust him. We have a horse like Scars Are Cool, who seemingly always gets bet a bit. He's one that's disappointed quite a bit recently, doesn't have great figures, so I'm not in love with him. So honestly, I'm not sure what direction I'm going to go when I look at this race.
Yeah, it's a very confusing race. And what you said about the pace I think is accurate, that it's likely they're going to be moving up front, but that doesn't mean that speed is necessarily at a disadvantage because having good position in these mile and 16th races when so much of the race is run around the turn, it just seems to be so important. And for that same reason, I kind of started by trying to make a case for the number 1 War Giant, who does look like he's got that cozy rail position and will be able to hold that spot inside. I just couldn't quite pull the trigger on him, and I ended up downgrading him and kind of just leaving him out totally at the end because while he does have some dirt speed figures going all the way back to 2018 that would make him tough in this race, I don't love his form over the past year, and I know he got back on track last time with a win. That was a significantly weaker spot. He was in for the $25,000 tag, a nominators of one allowance race that just... Sometimes those races can come up tough at Gulfstream. That one just didn't, and it was dominated by long shots. Also, it says that he's a first-time gelding for this race. I would take that with a grain of salt, just given the reporting down at Gulfstream. I'm guessing he was actually gelded back during that layoff from September to February, so I'm not going to put too much stock in that. I just couldn't quite make him the winner of this race, especially because I think the horse on the outside, the number 7 Ice-T, he also has plenty of speed, and I just think he's a more high-quality horse than War Giant. He's running some tougher races. I know he's been in some of those state-bred Florida races recently, but he's faced some good fields down there. And maybe the two-turn mile and 16th is going to be a bit of a hurdle for him because he's done most of his damage around one turn. But I just think he's a really solid runner who's been involved in some very fast paces in the past. And he looks like the one that's going to force the issue the most and might come into the stretch with the lead in this race. I think it's just a matter of how dangerous are the closers going to be. And I ended up landing on Legit as my top pick in this race. Don't love to take the favorite in a race that seems so competitive, but I just like this horse. I was actually pretty interested in him when he returned at Aqueduct last time, going the 6.5 furlong distance. that just ultimately turned out to be too short for him. He's really a horse that needs a little while to find his best stride, and he was closing really effectively at the end of that race, just ran out of ground. And I think the mile and 16th of this race is going to be much more in his wheelhouse. He's going to get pace to close into. Don't love deep closers in races like this. I just think he might have a slight quality edge over this field because like you, I wasn't quite convinced about the other closer, Scars or Cool, who just doesn't seem to have gone on since his 3-year-old season.
Yeah, if I had to make a top pick in here, it would be Legit. I'm just not crazy about the price. I think I'm not sure he'll be a deep closer in here. He'll probably be a little closer than what he's shown on the pace projector. He didn't have much to go on. A couple of his races came as a 3-year-old. Like I said, they were a long time ago. Just a few other thoughts. I'm totally with you on War Giant as far as being a gelding. I'm not sure when it happened, but I'd bet almost anything he was definitely gelded for the last start. And if not that one, probably the last two. And, other than that, Noble Thought is 4-1 on the morning line, but he's one that just doesn't have any early speed at all, really. So I'm just not interested in him. So I don't think it's a great betting race, but I do think Legit's going to run well and should be able to beat this field if he's anything near the horse we saw back in 2018.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think Noble Thought is an interesting horse in this race because when you first look at it, you say, oh, maybe Noble Thought's going to work out the perfect trip here. But I think when you start to pick apart Noble Thought's form, he's just not quite as fast as some other horses in this race. And I know that he's been in the exacta in 7 of his 8 races on the dirt, but I like to look at the speed figures more than just the placings the horses achieve when I'm assessing what surface they're better on. And he's run all of his better speed figures on the turf, and he got a pace collapse last time. He can't get a better setup than he got in that Claiming Crown Jewel behind Laytone. So I just thought Noble Thought was a cup below these, and I'm with you. I put Legit on top. I would probably use him most prominently with Ice-T and just kind of try to get those home in an exacta box. Let's move on to the 9th race at Gulfstream. This is the stakes on the card. It's the Unbridled going that same distance, a mile and a 16th on the dirt. And plenty of familiar names in here, some 3-year-olds dropping out of some Derby preps. We've got some that are also moving up in class. One of those is the favorite, the morning line favorite, the number 3, Dr. Post, who was pretty impressive, breaking his maiden, going the 7 furlong distance off the layoff last time. We'll see if they ultimately make this horse the favorite. I know there's some hype around him. He's been bet down to very short prices in both of his starts against Maiden Company, but he's got to handle the stretch out. He probably has to run a bit faster. I thought this was a much more competitive race than just settling for Dr. Post.
Yeah, I agree. It won't shock me if Dr. Post wins this race, but he's not a horse I'm in love with, especially he's probably going to be 6-5, 7-5, if not even lower than that. So there are some others I wanted to look at in here. I did want to hear when we get back to you some of the thoughts you had on Dr. Post and stretching out as far as how he's bred. I mean, he looks bred okay to go long to me, but I'll defer to you on that one. And similar for attachment rate, he's a horse who did go a mile a couple times, but he hasn't been 2 turns yet. He's been okay. Not one I love. The horse I eventually landed on is the 4-horse Restless Dancer, just because he looks to be clear as can be at that same mile and the 16th distance we talked about. I don't see him getting challenged much early. I know he dropped back last time in the Tampa Bay Derby. He was 4th, beaten 7 lengths behind King Guillermo, Sol Volante, and another in there who I forget was 3rd. But still, it was just a much better race than what he faces here. And speed is always dangerous. And if he's anything near that 6-1 morning line, I would certainly bet him. South Bend's one that's a little interesting for me. He's been running on turf lately and running okay, but I've always suspected that I still think dirt's probably his best surface, but in the end, I just don't know if he's good enough. He's kind of been running the same figures almost since his second start through his last one with very little improvement. So for me, he's one that's a little tough to get excited about, particularly since he may very well have had his speed dulled in all those turf races.
Yeah. As for Dr. Post, who I think I'm with you, is going to be the favorite in this race. He's bred okay to get longer distances. The dam was really more of a sprinting type. She was kind of a synthetic specialist. And she has not been much of a producer, so I can't really look to this horse's siblings to get much information about how he's going to handle the stretch out to a mile on the 16th, he does seem like the kind of horse that should be able to get at least this far. I thought it was interesting watching his maiden victory back that it didn't seem like he was traveling that well coming around the turn. John Velasquez was having to get into him, and it actually looked like his stablemate, who had finished second, was moving better than him at that point. But once they got into the stretch and he switched over to his right lead, he really leveled off nicely, and he does have a pretty fluid stride on him. So we'll see if the fact that most of this race is run around the turns hinders him in any way, just given the way that he traveled last time. But I do think he's a possible winner of this race. I don't want him at a short price because I don't think he's much more likely to win than some of the horses you mentioned, but he's one that I would definitely use. I agree about Restless Dancer. When you look at the pace of this race, it just seems like he's going to get that kind of trip that you want to get going a mile on the 16th. And he ran pretty well last time in that Tampa Bay Derby. He just seems pretty dangerous to me. I tried to make a case for South Bend, kind of like you did, because it seemed like both he and Necker Island showed a similar amount of ability for Stanley Huff last year. And he just kind of made the decision to try one on the turf and one on the dirt. And I'm not so sure that South Bend maybe wasn't the better dirt horse than Necker Island to begin with. And I know you said that his speed figures didn't improve that much, but I think he has taken a subtle step forward recently. I mean, he was second to Decorated Invader last time in the Cutler Bay. I know he got a strong pace to close into, but Decorated Invader is arguably the best three-year-old turf horse out there right now, and South Bend took a good run at him. We'll see if he gets enough pace to close into here. I think that's the big concern because in his turf races, he has really turned into a plodding type that needs everything to go his way up front. That might not be the case here. So we'll see what price he is, but he's one I definitely would want to consider. An attachment rate on the outside. He ran better than I thought he would in the Gotham last time. He's trying 2 turns for the first time. I had been pretty skeptical about his maiden victory in the Slop 2 back because that has not come back as a strong race other than attachment rate running well in the Gotham. The horses behind him just aren't that good. But attachment rate based on his last performance, I guess he's a contender. I thought he's one that was going to take money in this race as well, though. So I would lean more towards Restless Dancer in South Bend and sort of use Dr. Post at attachment rate more defensively.
I did want to mention, since you brought up Necker Island, he's a horse who his figures look okay. He ran a career best 108 in the Gotham last time. But when I went and watched the replay of that race, I just really didn't like that race at all. When the real running began, he was in good position, and he basically got passed by 3 or 4 horses, including some big long shots. And he just kind of plodded along and sucked up into that figure. So I don't really care for him at all. I mean, he's 12-1. It's not like he's some strong contender, but based on that 108 TimeformUS figure he shows last time, you'd think he'd be a contender, but I just didn't like what I saw visually from him.
Yeah, I agree with that. He's gotten a class test in his last 2 starts, and he just hasn't taken that step forward that he would have needed to. So I just don't think he's moved forward at all since his 2-year-old season. Let's move on to the final race we're going to discuss at Gulfstream before we move on to Oaklawn Park. And this one's a doozy. The 11th race on the card, optional claiming $75,000, though I don't think anybody's in for that optional claiming tag, or actually just one horse is Big Dollar Bill. This is just mostly a conditioned allowance race going the 7 furlongs, and we've got some pretty interesting returnees here from 2019, some horses who were competitive in graded stakes races last year, trying to get back on track, trying to start off their 2020 campaigns on a positive note. It's hard to know where to begin. I will say at the outset that I saw that Global Campaign was made 6-1 in the morning line. I'd love to get 6-1 on this horse, but I don't think there's any chance that happens. I thought Global Campaign was going to be the favorite in this race because he showed a lot of potential as a 3-year-old. I mean, his Peter Pan was one of the fastest performances we saw towards the first half of the season last year. And obviously he went to the sidelines later, but I think he's getting back to the races at the right distance, and he looked like he was the horse to beat, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I don't particularly care for the favorite at all in here on the morning line, Soldado. I mean, he's a good enough horse. He's had a couple nice wins for Todd Pletcher. But, I mean, I think the race has to start with Global Campaign and also Spin Off. I mean, these guys were among the better 3-year-olds we saw last year. They were both on the Derby trail. They both ran nice in some good prep races. They had some big speed figures. The question is obviously the layoff with both of them. I'm a little bit more leaning towards Spin Off just because I'm not sure Stanley Huff is that great off a layoff. He doesn't do it very often. His horses, once they get running, tend to run a lot. But either one of these, I'm with you. The morning line, I think, is bad. There's no way you're getting anywhere near 6-1 on Global Campaign. This is a race where the pace projector has it as not having a lot of pace, but it's a race where I don't think that matters a whole lot because the horses who are shown up front probably are a little bit over their head. Rare Form is turning back out of some longer races and stakes. He is quick and he probably will set the pace, but he's not a horse I trust at all. And Yorkton ran okay with a clear lead on a moderate pace last time, and I think it was the Sir Shackleton Stakes when behind Vekoma. But Vekoma just destroyed that field basically, and he was kind of the only one that did any running to stay second, but his 113 figure that day doesn't really make him a contender with the other two. So for me, it just comes down to Spinoff and Global Campaign, and I'll watch the tote board. Those are the two I like in here.
Yeah, I could make a case for a lot more horses in this race. I think that almost all of them can win. I mean, Big Dollar Bill is probably pretty hard to make, but I think there's a case to be made for a lot of horses in here. I agree with you about the pace. When I first looked at this, I thought, oh, Rare Form turning back in a much more favorable pace situation. I guess he's going to be dangerous. But I mean, Yorkton's going to be breathing down his neck, and not that they're going to be moving up front, but I just don't know if either of these horses really have the quality to win what really does amount to a listed stakes race. I know it's an optional claimer, but I mean, these are all stakes horses that they're facing. And I think it's interesting that Dale Romans has sort of never tried to make Rare Form into a sprinter. He's always tried to run him in these longer races. I mean, going at least as far as a mile. Just interesting because he seems to be a horse that has so much natural speed. So we'll see how he responds to the turn back to 7 furlongs. I wanted to go in a different direction. Like I said at the top, I think Global Campaign is the horse to beat in this race. And I mean, some people might say, oh, he ended up not panning out in the Jim Dandy last year because that was supposed to be, his breakout race against the top 3-year-olds heading into the Travers. But maybe he's just not a 2-turn mile and an eighth kind of horse. I mean, he showed so much potential early in his career going distances, 7 furlongs to around a mile. And, the Peter Pan, that was a 1-turn race, and he kind of ran a really fast mile that day and then just held on over Sir Winston, who was coming so fast at the end of that race. Maybe Global Campaign's just more of a miling type. So I think this is actually a good spot to return in, and I think he'll be the favorite. And I think he's the most likely winner. But looking at some others in this race, I didn't know what to do with Spinoff. To me, the 7 furlongs is a bigger question for Spinoff than it is for Global Campaign, because I know Spinoff won his debut going 5 furlongs eons ago, but to me, he's really turned into more of a grinding type that wants to go longer distances. He ran a really nice race in the Belmont, actually going wide around the turns, only losing by 3 lengths. He won well going a mile and an eighth last time at Saratoga. I just feel like those longer races are more suitable to Spinoff, and this feels like a starting point to me, and I just wasn't sure what we'd get from him if he'd get outrun early in this race and how he'd respond to that. But he's one I would use sort of underneath. I agree with your take on Soldado that this is just a tougher spot. He's looked okay in his last 2 starts, and I know he didn't seem totally comfortable with the trip last time, racing down inside, but this is just a big step up in class for him. So if he is the favorite or if he's close to favoritism, I would definitely prefer Global Campaign. There are 2 more horses that I want to talk about that are interesting in this race. One is a little more obvious. It's the number 7 Baracho. This is a horse that I was a fan of last year. I picked him in the Woody Stevens, and I thought he arguably could have won that race if he had gotten the outside trip that Hog Creek Hustle had gotten that day. But he's obviously a 7 furlong specialist. He is a horse who was down on that dead rail on Travers Day last time, so I wouldn't hold that Alan Jerkins performance against him too badly. The one problem is Rusty Arnold doesn't have the greatest numbers off layoffs. Still, though, Baracho wants to go this distance probably more than anybody else. And if he gets any kind of pace to close into, I think he's going to be dangerous. 12-1 seems like an insane price on a horse like him, who seems almost on par with the other 3-year-olds or the other newly turned 4-year-olds in this race. So I'll definitely be using him. And the other horse that I think most people will just dismiss in this race is the number 3 Hembry. And I know he looks like a turf specialist who's just making the transition to dirt out of desperation because he's been off form lately. But his Appleton wasn't that bad. I mean, he only lost by 2 lengths to Social Paranoia. And if you go way back in his PPs, there was a time when he was actually running faster dirt races than his surrounding turf form before Mike Maker claimed him and turned him into a turf horse. But Hembry actually has dirt races going back that they're not fast enough to win this race, but they suggest that he can handle the dirt better than most people might perceive. And he's a horse that if you read the Clocker reports, the Clockers always rave about how well this horse trains on the dirt. So I just think it's interesting that Mike Maker is finally trying the dirt again with him. And maybe there's not enough pace to close into. Maybe he's off form, but he's going to be a big price in this race. So I would lean most heavily on Hembry, Global Campaign, and Baracho.
Yeah, I'm with you. And just to show how strong this race is, we didn't even mention Majestic Dunhill, who had some nice performances in some stakes last year. He ran second in the General George behind Uncontested. He finished third in a stake at Laurel last time, but he's another one coming off of a long layoff. I don't particularly like him, but I'm just saying this is basically for a $48,000 allowance race. It's a pretty strong race. You could argue it's a stakes race. So I'm looking forward to seeing how several of these do in here. It's hard to say where they're pointing. And for me, I really don't know how to handle these long layoffs. Normally, some horses you want to say they're a prep, but the way things are these days, I want to say, what are they prepping for? We don't really know. So I kind of lean toward the side that they're going to be more out to win than they would normally be. For the Barnes would be, but it's just tough to say and something you got to take into account that you normally wouldn't consider.
No, I think that's a really good point. Everything's in limbo right now. I think a lot of these barns are just taking everything one race at a time. And, you'll see where you stand after your horse wins or loses this race. So I would imagine that you're right about that. A lot of these barns are out to win right now. Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, and we're going to stick with a similar kind of race as we start things off with their sixth race before getting into the stakes company later. This, again, is an optional claiming race for the older horses, going 6 furlongs, not 7 like they did at Gulfstream, but this is another race where you've got some horses not necessarily coming back off layoffs, but horses that do have prior stakes form. In this case, though, I think the question is, who is in form right now and who's going to be able to recapture their best form to win this race? Because a lot of the main contenders in here just seems like they've seen better days. And that's especially true of the likely favorite, the number 3 St. Joe Bay. Made his return last time in the San Carlos. Obviously, he was not going to beat Flagstaff that day. Faded at the end of that race. Is this just the class relief that he needs, or is he the kind of horse we should be taking a stand against?
He's the kind of horse I'm going to take a stance against. He's in for the tag, which to me, it makes sense. He's an 8-year-old. He's only run 3 times in the last year and a half, basically. So it makes sense. Who's going to reach in and claim this guy for $80,000? I don't think it's a whole lot of a risk, and maybe they wouldn't be all that unhappy to lose him at this point. But he's not a horse I would want as probably the favorite in here. And then when I look at the morning line, I see Nero is the second choice, which that makes no sense whatsoever to me. I know he's got some reputation from way back when he had a couple nice starts to begin his career. But this is a horse that just got dusted at Will Rogers Downs at even money in a weak stake, which was nowhere near as strong as this race. So I want no parts of him. So I went looking for some other horses personally. It is a race that the pace projector has showing as a hot pace. I can't really disagree with that when you look through the PPs. Fire Crow is a horse who almost always wants to lead, as is Drina Star, who draws the inside. So there's really not much choice but for that horse to at least try and go. So this is a race where I went and looked for some closers. And for me, I kind of settled on the one that has the best late pace rating, and that's Almuth Mar. He moves into the barn of Phil D'Amato he used to be trained by Kieran McLaughlin, but he's been working up a storm. I think he's going to get a nice setup. And while he is a closer off the pace horse per se, he's not a horse that's going to be coming from 20 lengths out of it or anything. So he is the one I landed on. I tried to look at some others like Wilbo, who's won at least a few races at Oaklawn that I remember and likes to come from a bit off the pace, but he's one that seems to have lost a step to me. And I just couldn't make a big case for anybody else with that big morning line on Almuth Mar. If he's anywhere near that, that's the horse I'll be betting.
Yeah, we see this race very similarly. I'm not way against St. Joe Bay. I do think he's probably the most likely winner of this race by a slim margin, but it does feel like he's going to be the prohibitive favorite because I agree with you. Nero, I know he always takes money. I have trouble seeing him take money again because it seems like his mediocre form, let's say, is just exposed by now. And Steve Asmussen, by shipping him to Will Rogers Downs, is not exactly handling him like he's one of his better horses. So I just think maybe the illusion that the old Nero can still return is kind of gone at this point. And St. Joe Bay, maybe he's going to get clear early, but there's plenty of speed in this race. I mean, the one, Len Starr, I don't think really is of this quality, but the number 4, Firecrow, he's really fast early, and he's going to have to make St. Joe Bay work on the front. And I just think that's going to be a tough situation for St. Joe Bay. We went to the same 2 horses. I think there's absolutely no chance that Al Mithmar is even half of his morning line of 15-1. To me, he looks more like a 9-2 shot in this race just because he's run fast enough to win and he's moving into a really good barn of Phil D'Amato. So he just makes a lot of sense to me. This is a horse that I used to like quite a bit in New York when he was running for Kieran McLaughlin. And he ran some good races. He's not the most consistent type, and he's not a horse that loves to come from way back in the pack. But I don't know if he's going to have to be that far back in this race. And the one negative that I found with Al Mithmar is that Phil D'Amato, as well as he does in so many situations, layoffs are not his strong suit. I looked up in DRF Formulator specifically off 180 days or more, first off a trainer switch. He's just 3 for 48% with a 48-cent ROI. So that's really not a good move. But if this horse is a price, I won't put too much stock in that. I just don't know if he's going to be that big of a price. So I'll definitely use him. I just reversed the 2 horses that you mentioned, the closers. I would put the number 10 Wilbo on top if I had to make a top pick in this race. His last race that was won by Mojo Man when Firecrow almost went gate to wire, that was a race where there was another speed horse in the race. That horse, I want to say his name is Anywhere, Anytime, and he dwelt at the start badly and basically just was a non-participant in the race. And that left Firecrow on the lead through pretty moderate fractions, especially compared with how the pace looked to have shaped up. It seemed like there was a lot of pace in that race, and Firecrow just ended up getting loose on the lead. And I think that really hindered a horse like Wilbo, who would have gotten more pace to close into that day. And he is a horse that really does need some pace ahead of him. And I think in this race, as long as all the horses break from the gate, there's got to be a quick pace up front. And sure, he's not the horse that he once was, but he does have speed figures somewhat recently that would put him in the mix here, and or at least are as fast as Al Mithmar was running. So I would use these 2 and give the slight edge to Wilbo.
The only other horse I wanted to mention in here was Len Starr. He was a horse that had some back figures that looked like he could be competitive on the turn back. He had ran nice sprinting, but when I looked at his last race at the chart, it was a race where it was so slow, it was almost hard to believe it. I considered breaking it out just because it didn't make a lot of sense, but ultimately decided not to. And that's why if you use our PPs, you'll see the end saying that we thought about breaking it out but didn't. And that race has turned out really weak. I think there's been 7 runbacks from the race and not a single horse has so much as hit the board. So I quickly went away from Len Starr, but just wanted to give some insight into maybe how people would want to use those codes. And that N was one where it tells me, hey, let me go back and look and see what's happened with that race. And that's what I saw.
That's some good insight there, and I agree about Len Starr. He's just a horse that seems to need the lead, and he's just not going to get it here because I don't think he's fast enough to compete with the horses we just talked about. Let's move on to those 2 stakes races at Oaklawn Park. Beginning with the 9th, it's the Bachelor going 6 furlongs for the 3-year-olds. And for a listed $100,000 stakes, we've actually got some really talented runners in here. And I think we've got to start with the number 7, 8 Rings, who was briefly going to be on the Derby Trail, but he ended up taking a while to come around this year for Bob Baffert. So they're targeting an easier spot for his 3-year-old debut, this listed stakes race, but turning all the way back to 6 furlongs, probably not the move that a lot of people expected with this horse, although he was successful in his debut, sprinting going 5.5 furlongs at Del Mar last summer. So maybe he's quick enough to handle it, but he's facing some pretty talented sprinters in this spot.
He is. I got to tell you, when I opened up the past performances for this one, I almost did a double take. I certainly wasn't expecting to see 8 Rings in here. And for a second, it almost didn't register. 8 Rings. Where do I know that name from? But that's where it's been so long. I mean, this guy was the favorite in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. He obviously didn't run very well that day. After pressing the pace, he kind of dropped out of it. But for me, it's just a little alarming for a guy like Bob Baffert, how long it's taken him to get back to the races. So while I certainly think he can win. I'm almost sure he's going to be the favorite just based on reputation in here, as the morning line predicts. He's a horse that I just can't get that excited about. I know he's been working well, but like you said, the distance is short, and that 5.5 furlong race, you don't know who he was facing in there and what they turned out to be. I mean, Shooter Shoot was in there. He's turned out pretty good, but I don't put a lot of stock in those sprints a long time ago. I think he's a horse who probably wants to go longer. So, I mean, I'm not sure what to do with him. I'm not going to totally dismiss him, but I do think there are some others in here that can beat him. And I think that starts with Long Weekend. He's a quick horse who was in a race with a lot of speed last time. He was able to outrun them early, kind of get into a nice cruising speed, set a moderate pace, and just blew the field away. And in this race, there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of speed. So he is going to be my top pick in here because I think he's really dangerous. I think he's got more in him than that 113 speed figure he ran last time. He won pretty easy. I'm not always one to say he could have ran faster that day, but I do think he has more in the tank. And I'll let you go from there. There's a couple others I want to talk about that I think can win, but for me, he's the top contender, even above 8 rings.
Yeah, we agree about that. I don't know how they're going to bet this race, but I do think Long Weekend should be the favorite because he ran so well last time. As you said, he just blew them away. I mean, I was skeptical of whether he could sustain pace pressure. It didn't really matter because he was just quicker than the horses early, and he kept going. And he's got the perfect outside post position here that gives Joe Talmo plenty of options, although I think he'll probably just prove to be quicker than them again, as the pace projector indicates. So I think that he's going to be tough to catch, and to me, he's the most likely winner of this race. Just to finish up 8 rings for a sec, I'm kind of with you. It's surprising to see him in this race. His dam was a sprinter strictly, but he's by Empire Maker, and it just feels like one that this is a prep for something. I don't want to say that Bob Baffert is shipping a horse out to Oaklawn for no reason, because obviously Bob Baffert usually comes to Oaklawn with intention. But this just seems like a horse that got a late start. It's got to begin somewhere, and this is probably not the most important race to them. I also found a stat for Bob Baffert in Formulator. Horses turning back from routes to sprints on the dirt, coming off layoffs of 4 to 8 months. He's just 3 for 16 with an ROI that's 95 cents. So these horses tend to take more money than they're really supposed to off layoffs for Bob Baffert when they're turning back. So I just kind of wanted to take a stand against 8 rings here. Like I said, Long Weekend's the horse to beat, but the horse that I would settle on as my top pick in this race, just hoping that he's around the 3rd choice, is the number 3 Echo Town. This is a horse that I've just liked all of his races quite a bit. He didn't get bet in his debut at the fairgrounds when actually his stablemate Erner took all the money, but he ran really well that day, earned a speed figure that kind of pointed it out as a horse that could be successful in some sprint stakes races later on in the year. And I don't think it's any surprise to see him coming into this race off some solid speed figures, because 2 back, I know we got beaten by Lycan, who's also in this race. I did not like the trip that Echo Town got that day. I thought that he was just in an uncomfortable spot all the way around the turn, got shuffled back early. He probably should have won that race, and I think it was just a combination of bad luck and rider error that cost him the win that day. And last time out in the slop, I didn't even think he looked like he was that comfortable over the track, especially on the turn. Ricardo Santana really had to get into him, but he leveled off late, finished the job, beat that field soundly, earned another solid speed figure. He's going to be that horse that works out a good trip in behind the speeds. He'll get that run at Long Weekend in the stretch. And I just think he's better than he might look at first glance. I don't know if he's going to be 9-2. I think there's no chance that he's a bigger price than the other Steve Asmussen horse, Little Menace. I don't get that morning line at all. That just seems a little lazy to me to make Echo Town a bigger price than Little Menace in this race. But I do think he's the biggest danger to Long Weekend.
Yeah, I was going to say he was the first of the other couple horses I wanted to mention. You stole my thunder a little with the morning line, but it's pretty obvious that wasn't any earth-shattering news. I'm not sure what they were thinking on that one, because Little Menace isn't going to be 4-1 in here. I mean, he just got his doors blown off by Long Weekend. He wasn't even competitive, so I'm not buying that for a second. But I don't really have much to add with Echo Town. I think he's a really good horse. He ran a 114 TimeformUS last time. So I definitely think he's one of the stronger contenders in here. The other horse I want to mention is Ginobli. He was the horse who ran and looked so good against Nadal too back in the San Vicente, his first race of the year. And then he just completely laid an egg last time in his start at Oaklawn. I think he went off less than even money that day. And basically was never really a factor. He didn't break good. The pace was fast, and he just wasn't ever able to get into the race. So I don't know what to make of Ginobili. I think he has the talent to win this. I don't think he'll be 6-1 either. People might dismiss that race a little bit, and they're still going to see that Nadal 2 back, and he was only beaten 3/4 of a length. But I don't love him in here. I wouldn't bet him to win, but if I were playing pick 4s or pick 5s, he is one I would probably throw on my tickets.
Yeah, I think Ginobili is an interesting horse because he's got that gigantic speed figure 2 back that would make him good enough to win this race. But I think it's important to look at the pace projector and where Ginobili is in the pace projector, because after the San Vicente, I saw a lot of people saying that was some insanely fast pace, that Nadal ran an amazing race to turn back, to basically survive that fast pace. And it was somewhat fast. I mean, there's one red color coded pace figure in our PPs, but it's not like that was a supersonic early pace. And if you look through Ginobili's PPs, when he does face races that have really fast opening quarters, he's not always quick enough to make the lead. And that was the case last time. He didn't break that well, but it's not like it was a disaster. He didn't stumble or anything. He was just kind of slow into stride. And I think if that happens again, because it's happened to him before, he's going to be up against it here because he's not shown that he can pass horses.
Yeah, that's a good point. He didn't look comfortable at all last time, particularly being in traffic, which he would certainly need the lead, and it doesn't look like he can get it. But he does have the ability, and like I said, if he's 3-1, I'm not going to use him in my tickets. But if he's a higher price, I might toss him in. I'm not a big fan, but he's definitely got some ability. And, that does kind of go back to it's just different at Oaklawn compared to these races at California. We've talked about it. We talked about it with Flagstaff last week, where when you get these big fields, it's just a whole different ball game than it is in there when you're running against 5 and 6 horses in these stakes races. So he didn't adapt very well, and he would have to do it here, and it's probably unlikely.
And it's also the difference between 7 furlongs and 6 furlongs, because obviously 6 furlongs is the longest sprint distance they can run at Oaklawn. And I think that's a good transition into the final race we're going to talk about, the Carousel, 10th race on the card at Oaklawn on Saturday. This one is 6 furlongs, and we've got a big favorite in this race, the number 1 Bellafita, who's going to be trying the shortest distance since her 2-year-old season when she won the Sorrento. She's sprinted multiple times since then, but they've all been 7 furlong races. And if you look at the pace projector for this race, doesn't seem like Bellafina is going to be quick enough to be out contesting the pace here as she was in the La Brea last time. Now, I know that Bellafina is kind of a difficult horse for the pace projector to place because they've used a variety of different running styles with her. But I think even if they just are in a full-out drive out of the gate, there are some pretty quick horses in this race that are just going to outrun her.
Yeah, I think she is a really tough call what to do with her. I don't think drawing down in the rail position is doing her any favors either, because she either has to go or she's going to have to get shuffled back a little bit. Maybe she can rally into what could be a fast pace and just kind of save ground. But I mean, I don't love her in here. She can win for sure, but I imagine she's another that's going to be in the 6-5 to 7-5 range, is going to have to overcome some obstacles. So this is one where, again, I'm going to try to beat the favorite. I probably do that a little too much, but I just don't love her in here. She is the most talented horse. If this was a 7 furlong race and she was drawn out in the 7 post, she'd probably be a single for me, but that's not the case here. It's just there's some really quick horses in here. We got Amy's Challenge, who's always fast, even though she did show a little bit of a new dimension last time to rate a little off the pace. That was a shorter race at 5.5, and it's not like she was way back. She was less than 2 lengths behind at every call, and I think she'll probably go right to the front if possible. We have Sunnydale, who's a really quick one in here. So there's just a lot of ways you can go in this race. Mia Mischief, who is a graded stakes winner, is in here as well. She comes off kind of a really interesting allowance race in which she won at 2-5. But visually, I wasn't all that impressed with it. I'm not a big fan of her. She's another one in the pace projector who usually likes to be up front, and she's probably going to get shuffled a bit back. So for me, this is a race where, again, I went a different route, and I actually landed on a real long shot in here in Lady Subi for John Sadler. She's a horse who's turning back from routing for quite a while, but she has sprinted with some success in the past. She's just one that I love her ability. I think she's a good filly. She has the figures to win a race like this, and I love her post position draw. I love where she's shown in the pace projector. I think she can sit there, and at that kind of price, she's a horse I'm definitely going to be using.
Okay, I'm not going to talk you off a long shot because I've picked some crazy horses on these podcasts as well. I didn't quite see Lady Subi in this race, but she's going to be a big price, so I'll be rooting for her for you. Bellafina, she's the horse to beat by far. I don't want to suggest otherwise. I mean, she did earn that gigantic speed figure in the La Brea last time. I know horses haven't quite run back to that number that we gave her, but if it's low, it's only 5 points low. And she's just earned a series of speed figures that are faster than everybody else has earned. Even if she encounters some adversity, she's probably going to be able to overcome it and still beat this field. But like you said, she's going to be a very short price. The rail draw, it's not ideal for her. So there could be some obstacles for her. And I don't love a favorite that might have to overcome some things, although she clearly is the horse to beat. I'm going to go with a slightly more logical alternative at a bigger price. That's the number 6, Amy's Challenge. I know that the pace projector is showing her on the lead in this race. I think the fact that she rated so successfully last time is going to maybe not make her connection so intent on getting the lead, especially since she's drawn outside of the other speeds, Sunnydale, Midnight Fantasy, and Classy Act. If they want to just rate outside of those horses in the clear without her taking any dirt in her face, I think that might be a perfect trip for Amy's Challenge. And her last race is an interesting one to talk about from a speed figures perspective, because it was 5.5 furlongs, which isn't a tricky distance that they don't run all the time. And I was looking at the buyer for this race, and I know you don't look at the buyers that much, but it seems like the buyers put it in line with the other sprint races of the day. And it looks like you might have broken out this race from the 6 furlong races, just if I'm, reading it right. And I think what you did makes a lot of sense for the horses in that race, because it does seem like that was a pretty strong race where they were really moving up front. And we've had 2 runbacks from that race last weekend, those being Break Even, who obviously didn't run well, but also Mount Brave. And they ran 1-2 in that really tough allowance race last weekend. And they were the 2 speed horses. So I think it's a race where you do want to respect the horses that were up close to the pace. And that was the case for Midnight Fantasy and Amy's Challenge. And I just think Amy's Challenge, she's the one horse in this race, aside from Mia Mischief, who seems to me to be a little off form, who has the back speed figures to really give a challenge to Bellafina. And Oaklawn Park is her home. She runs her best races here. And I just think if there's going to be a race where she causes an upset, maybe this is going to be it.
Yeah, it's a good point about the 5.5 furlong races. I do the figures for Oaklawn, so I know the track like the back of my hand, and that's a pretty common thing that happens at Oaklawn. Is the 5.5 and the 6 furlong races just don't line up like you would expect on your common speed chart. It's not something that happens every time, but I would say the majority of times I use different variants for those distances. I've just learned in these games, some things you just can't explain when it comes to speed figures and why things like that happen. But 5.5 furlongs is a really tricky distance at a lot of tracks. They never really seem to line up the way you'd expect them to. So I had no problem making that figure. I did it off the horses in the race there. And it was one where, they're just, no way I would believe all those horses were going to regress and run a low figure. And I didn't give it a second thought and really haven't had to, given the run backs of last week. I do want to mention, I'm with you. Bellafina can easily win this race. If I'm playing some horizontal bets, I'm certainly going to use her. She's just the one I do want to take a shot against. I will definitely use Amy's Challenge. I've been a fan of hers for a long time. Like I said, I dig like how she was able to rate off the pace. So I would be using her as well. And just the ones I don't want in here, because, you can't use them all in these races, is Mia Mischief, as I mentioned, and Midnight Fantasy would be the other one. And that's just strictly because of the post position. She also showed she could rate a little bit last time, but she was drawn outside that day and kind of got a nice, easy trip, where today she's drawn inside, is probably going to be in a lot more traffic and face more pressure. So she's the other one I don't like in here.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. I think we have very similar takes on those two other horses. Well, that's all the racing for this week. I think it turns out that we probably are going to have enough content for a TimeformUS Pacecast to recap these races on Tuesday next week, because even in the non-stakes races, it feels like there are going to be some allowance races that are going to be worth discussing afterwards. So we'll play it by ear and see if there's some races to recap on Tuesday. But watch out for that. We'll certainly let you know if we're recording that day. For now, remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, guys, and we'll let you know if we're recording another TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday.